Greetings, lore seekers, and welcome back to the Lorelord, where we uncover the mysteries hidden in the deepest corners of our favorite universes. Today, we're diving into one of the most obscure and fascinating pieces of Warhammer 40,000 history, a story about a chaos god who existed, then didn't, and left behind only the faintest traces of his presence in the lore. His name was Malibron, and if you've never heard of him, that's exactly the point. This is the tale of the fifth Chaos God, a deity of such dark and specific power that Games Workshop themselves decided he was too dangerous for their universe and quietly erased him from existence. But like all good mysteries, the evidence remains if you know where to look. What makes this story particularly fascinating is that it gives us a unique window into the creative process behind Warhammer 40,000, how the setting evolved, how certain ideas were deemed too extreme even for the grim darkness of the far future, and how sometimes the most interesting stories are the ones that almost were. So settle in as we explore the rise and fall of Malibron, the Chaos God of Anarchy, and discover why his removal from the lore might tell us more about the nature of chaos than his presence ever did. To understand Malibron's story, we need to travel back to the late 1980s and early 1990s, when Warhammer 40,000 was still finding its identity. This was the era of Realm of Chaos, a series of supplements that would define much of what we know about the Chaos Gods today. The original conception of chaos was more fluid and experimental than what we see in modern 40k. Games Workshop was still figuring out the fundamental nature of their dark gods, and writers were given more freedom to explore radical concepts. It was during this period that various minor chaos powers were introduced, tested, and either incorporated into the main pantheon or quietly forgotten. Malibron emerged from this experimental phase as something unique, not just another aspect of warfare, decay, change, or excess, but something that challenged the very foundations of civilization itself. He represented anarchy in its purest form, the complete rejection of all order, structure, and authority. In early chaos iconography, there was occasionally reference to a 5-pointed star, rather than the 8-pointed star we know today. While most assumed this was simply an artistic choice, or perhaps represented the 4 main Chaos Gods plus Chaos Undivided, some sources suggested it represented 5 distinct powers. The 5th point, according to these obscure references, belonged to a god whose very nature was antithetical to the concept of pantheons, hierarchies, or organized worship. This was our first hint of Malibron, a chaos god who embodied the rejection of gods themselves. Historical note: these references are extremely rare and appear primarily in early gaming supplements and White Dwarf articles from the late 1980s. What made Malibron unique among the Chaos Gods was his fundamental paradox. He was the god of rejecting gods, the authority that despised authority, the power that sought to destroy power itself. While Khorne represented martial honor and Nurgle embodied acceptance, Malibron stood for pure negation. His followers didn't build temples or organize cults in the traditional sense. Instead, they formed loose networks of anarchists, revolutionaries, and nihilists who sought to tear down any structure they encountered, including, paradoxically, the very chaos cults that served other gods. This created a fascinating theological problem within chaos itself. How do you worship a god who despises worship? How do you serve a power that rejects service? The answer, according to the limited sources available, was through pure destruction. Not the purposeful destruction of Khorne's warfare or the inevitable decay of Nurgle's entropy, but the joyful annihilation of everything that represented order, structure, or meaning. Malibron's influence was said to manifest wherever civilization turned against itself. Not through external conquest or internal corruption, but through the complete rejection of the very concept of civilization. His followers were the ones who burned libraries, not to suppress knowledge, but because knowledge itself represented structure. They destroyed art not because they found it offensive, but because art represented human creativity and achievement. Most disturbingly, Malibron's followers were known to attack other chaos cults with the same enthusiasm they brought to destroying imperial worlds. They saw the organized worship of Khorne, the calculated schemes of Tsinhut, the structured decay of Nurgle, and the refined excess of Slaanesh as just more forms of authority to be destroyed. This made Malibron incredibly dangerous from a narrative perspective. He wasn't just an enemy of order, but an enemy of chaos itself, threatening to unravel the very cosmology that held the Warhammer 40,000 universe together. The clearest references to Malibron appeared in a handful of White Dwarf articles from the early 1990s, particularly in gaming scenarios that dealt with anarchist cults and nihilist uprisings. These articles never named Malibron directly, but described Chaos followers whose behavior didn't fit the patterns of the four main gods. One particularly intriguing scenario described a hive-world rebellion where the insurgents destroyed infrastructure, burned food stores, and even attacked their own supply lines, behavior that made no tactical sense unless viewed through the lens of pure anarchism rather than strategic rebellion. Perhaps the most concrete evidence of Malibron's existence comes from references to a planned rogue trader supplement that was never published. Gaming magazines from the period mentioned a forthcoming book that would explore the fifth face of chaos and introduce new rules for anarchist warbands. This supplement was reportedly completed and even playtested, but was pulled from publication at the last minute. Industry insiders from the period have suggested that Games Workshop's management became concerned about the political implications of a game faction that explicitly promoted anarchism and nihilism. Note: attempts to locate copies of this unpublished supplement have been unsuccessful, though rumors persist that copies exist in private collections. Throughout early Warhammer 40,000 artwork, careful observers can spot occasional symbols that don't correspond to any of the known Chaos gods. Most notable is a recurring motif of a broken crown or shattered scepter, often appearing in background details of Chaos-themed illustrations. These symbols appear most frequently in artwork, depicting widespread destruction that serves no apparent strategic purpose. Cities burned not for conquest, but for the joy of burning. Monuments destroyed not to erase history, but to negate achievement itself. The most likely explanation for Malibron's removal from the lore relates to concerns about the real-world implications of promoting anarchism, even in a fictional context. The early 1990s were a time of increased scrutiny of role-playing games, with critics claiming that fantasy violence could influence real-world behavior. A chaos god who explicitly promoted the destruction of all authority, including governmental and social structures, would have been particularly vulnerable to such criticism. Games Workshop, seeking to maintain their growing mainstream appeal, likely decided that Malibron represented an unnecessary risk. From a storytelling perspective, Malibron presented significant challenges. The four main Chaos gods work because they represent corrupted aspects of fundamental drives. Ambition becomes scheming, martial virtue becomes bloodlust, acceptance becomes stagnation, and passion becomes excess. Malibron, however, represented pure negation, the absence of drive rather than its corruption. This made him difficult to integrate into stories that depended on characters having motivations and goals. How do you write compelling narratives about followers who want nothing except the destruction of everything? The four Chaos Gods exist in a state of dynamic tension, each opposing and being opposed by the others in a complex web of relationships. Khorne opposes Slaanesh, Tzeentch opposes Nurgle, and each god's domains create natural conflicts that drive narrative tension. Malibron threatened this balance by opposing everyone equally. His followers would attack Khorne cultists with the same enthusiasm as Imperial forces, making him less a participant in the cosmic struggle and more a force for its complete dissolution. While Malibron himself was erased, elements of his concept survived in other forms. The idea of chaos as a purely destructive force, not seeking to rule or corrupt but simply to destroy, can be seen in various later developments. The concept of chaos spawn, mindless creatures that exist only to spread destruction without purpose or plan, shares some DNA with Malibron's nihilistic philosophy. Similarly, the background lore of certain chaos cults that seem to serve destruction for its own sake, rather than advancing any particular god's agenda, may be echoes of the lost fifth god. In some modern Warhammer 40,000 sources, there are references to unnamed or forgotten chaos powers that once challenged the four main gods. While these are typically dismissed as minor demons or extinct cults, they may represent sanitized versions of concepts that once included Malibron. The idea that chaos once had more diversity, more gods with different spheres of influence, adds depth to the cosmology, even if the specific details have been obscured. It suggests that the current four-god system isn't natural or inevitable, but the result of a cosmic winnowing process. Contemporary Warhammer 40,000 occasionally features storylines about nihilistic cults or anarchist uprisings that don't clearly serve any of the four Chaos Gods. These stories often feature antagonists whose motivations are purely destructive, seeking not to advance any cause but simply to tear down existing structures. While these elements are never explicitly connected to Malibron, they serve a similar narrative function, representing the appeal of pure negation in a universe where all other options seem corrupted or hopeless. The Primarch connection, an alternative theory. While most evidence points to Malibron being a fifth Chaos God, there exists an intriguing alternative theory that has gained traction among dedicated lore scholars. That Malibron was not a Chaos God at all, but rather one of the two Lost Primarchs, specifically the 11th Primarch, whose name and deeds were expunged from Imperial records. This theory emerged from careful analysis of the timing of Malibron's disappearance from the lore and the concurrent development of the Primarch mythology. As Games Workshop began to flesh out the 20 Legiones Astartes and their Gene Fathers, they simultaneously began removing references to certain chaos entities, including Malibron. The connection becomes more intriguing when we consider the nature of Imperial censorship. The two lost Primarchs weren't simply killed or forgotten, they were actively erased from history, their names struck from records, their legions disbanded or absorbed into other forces. This mirrors exactly what happened to Malibron in the real world. Complete removal from official sources, with only hints remaining. If Malibron was indeed a Primarch rather than a Chaos God, his sphere of influence, anarchy and the destruction of authority, takes on new meaning. Perhaps he was a Primarch who turned not to chaos worship, but to pure nihilism, rejecting not just the Emperor's authority, but the very concept of leadership itself. This would explain several puzzling aspects of early lore. Why would his followers attack other Chaos cults with such fervor? Because they weren't Chaos cultists at all, but the remnants of a Space Marine legion that had rejected all forms of hierarchy and organization. Their attacks on Imperial and Chaos forces alike would make perfect sense if they were led by a Primarch who had concluded that all authority was inherently corrupt. The timeline supports this theory. References to Malibron peak during the same period when Games Workshop was developing the backstory of the Horus Heresy and the fate of the missing Primarchs. As the company decided to keep two Primarchs deliberately mysterious, they may have realized that having a named, developed, Lost Primarch contradicted their narrative goals. Some scholars have noted similarities between the language used to describe Malibron's followers and certain cryptic references to expunged legions in early Imperial texts. Phrases like "those who turned brother against brother" and "the sons who rejected their father" appear in both contexts. If the 11th Primarch was Malibron, his crime might not have been falling to chaos, but something potentially worse, convincing Space Marines to abandon their loyalty entirely. Where other traitor legions at least maintained military structure and hierarchy, Malibron's legion might have dissolved into anarchist cells that rejected the very concept of command structure. This would represent a unique threat that neither loyalist nor traitor forces could tolerate. Chaos needs hierarchy to function. Even rebel forces require leaders and followers. But pure anarchism threatens the foundations of military organization itself. Evidence and counterarguments. Several pieces of evidence support the Primarch theory. The timing of Malibron's removal coincides with the development of the Lost Primarch concept. Early references to his followers sometimes describe them as gene warriors rather than typical cultists. The systematic nature of his erasure mirrors the deliberate expungement of Primarch records. His followers' military capabilities seem too advanced for typical Chaos cultists. However, counter-arguments exist. Most references to Malibron describe him in terms consistent with demonic entities rather than post-human commanders. The theological language used around his worship suggests divine rather than mortal allegiance. His sphere of influence, pure anarchy, seems more suited to a warp entity than a physical being. Perhaps the most intriguing possibility is that both theories are partially correct. What if Malibron began as the 11th Primarch, but, through his rejection of all authority, including his own divine nature, somehow transformed into something approaching a Chaos god? This would explain both the Primarch-like references and the divine attributes. In this scenario, the 11th Primarch's fall wasn't to Chaos worship, but to pure nihilistic philosophy. His rejection of all structure and meaning was so complete that he transcended physical existence entirely, becoming a warp entity that embodied pure negation. This transformation would be unprecedented in 40k lore, a Primarch becoming not a demon prince serving existing gods, but something entirely new and terrifying. Theoretical reconstruction, what Malibron might have been, the complete anti-god. Based on the available evidence, we can construct a theoretical profile of what Malibron represented in the Warhammer 40,000 cosmology. Unlike the other Chaos gods, who offer twisted versions of positive drives, Malibron offered pure negation, the complete rejection of existence itself. His followers wouldn't seek power. That would be too much like Tzeentch, glory in battle. Too much like Khorne, acceptance of decay. Too much like Nurgle, or even the pursuit of sensation. Too much like Slaanesh. Instead, they would seek the end of seeking itself, the complete destruction of all motivation, meaning, and purpose. Malibron's existence would have added a fascinating philosophical dimension to chaos. The four main gods represent corrupted aspects of life and consciousness. They are what happens when good things go bad. Malibron would have represented something more fundamental, the rejection of the value of existence itself. This makes him simultaneously the most honest and most terrifying of the Chaos gods. While the others lie to their followers, promising power, honor, peace, or pleasure, Malibron would have offered exactly what he delivered: nothing. In many ways, Malibron might have represented the final stage of chaos corruption, not the transformation of positive drives into negative ones, but the complete abandonment of drive itself. He would have been the god you turn to when you've given up not just on hope, but on the very concept of wanting things to be different. This makes his removal from the lore particularly interesting from a metatextual perspective. Games Workshop may have realized that Malibron represented something too close to real-world despair and nihilism, not the fun, melodramatic evil of the other Chaos gods, but something genuinely hopeless and destructive. Despite decades of searching, several key pieces of evidence about Malibron remain elusive. The unpublished Rogue Trader supplement, if it exists, would provide definitive proof of his place in early 40,000 development. Similarly, design documents or internal memos from Games Workshop discussing his removal would clarify the reasons behind the decision. Some collectors claim to possess early playtest materials that reference 5 Chaos gods, but these claims have never been substantiated with public evidence. The rarity of early Warhammer 40,000 materials makes verification difficult, and the passage of time has likely destroyed many relevant documents. For dedicated lore scholars and collectors, the search for Malibron evidence has become something of a holy grail. Every early White Dwarf article is scrutinized for references, every piece of concept art examined for hidden symbols, every interview with early Games Workshop staff analyzed for hints. This search itself has become part of the Malibron legend, the idea that somewhere out there, hidden in someone's collection or forgotten in a warehouse, lies definitive proof of the 5th Chaos god's existence. The Malibron story illustrates how Warhammer 40,000 has evolved from its early experimental phase into a more carefully managed intellectual property. The willingness to completely erase a developed concept shows how dramatically the setting has changed since its anarchic early days. Modern 40k rarely introduces concepts as radical or potentially problematic as Malibron. The setting has become more refined, but perhaps also more conservative, less willing to explore ideas that might be genuinely disturbing rather than merely dark. Malibron's erasure raises interesting questions about the nature of canon in fictional universes. If a concept was officially published but later removed, does it still count as part of the setting? What about concepts that were developed but never published? The existence of lost lore like Malibron suggests that canon is more fluid than we often assume, not a fixed body of knowledge, but a constantly evolving interpretation of what belongs in the universe and what doesn't. Part of Malibron's enduring fascination lies in his hidden nature. Because he was erased rather than simply ignored, he takes on an almost mythical quality, the forbidden knowledge that exists just beyond reach. This appeals to the same impulse that drives much of Warhammer 40,000's appeal. The sense that there are always deeper mysteries, darker secrets, and more terrible truths waiting to be discovered in the darkness between the stars. In modern Warhammer 40,000, the concept of chaos undivided serves some of the functions that Malibron might have fulfilled. Warriors and cultists who serve chaos as a whole, rather than any specific god, often display the kind of nihilistic destructiveness that Malibron embodied. However, Chaos Undivided typically represents the worship of all four gods simultaneously, rather than the rejection of divine authority entirely. It's a synthesis of the existing powers, rather than an alternative to them. Throughout modern 40k lore, we occasionally encounter characters and factions whose motivations are purely destructive. They don't serve any particular chaos god, seek any specific goal, or promote any ideology beyond destruction itself. These elements, whether intentional or not, echo the concept of Malibron. They represent the appeal of pure negation in a universe where all positive action seems doomed to corruption or failure. In the fan community, Malibron has taken on a life of his own, despite his absence from official lore. Some fan-created materials have attempted to reconstruct his mythology, while others have used the concept of the lost fifth god as inspiration for original characters and storylines. This fan engagement demonstrates the power of mystery in fictional worlds. Sometimes what's hidden or lost can be more compelling than what's explicitly revealed. Fellow lore seekers, the story of Malibron teaches us something profound about both Warhammer 40,000 and the nature of storytelling itself. Sometimes the most powerful elements of a fictional universe are the ones that are hinted at, but never fully revealed. The shadows cast by lights we never see. Malibron's absence from the lore creates a space for imagination and speculation that his presence might not have allowed. By being erased, he becomes more mysterious and compelling than if he had simply been another, officially sanctioned, chaos god. The search for definitive evidence of Malibron's place in early Warhammer 40,000 continues, and perhaps that's as it should be. In a universe built around hidden knowledge and forbidden truths, it's fitting that one of its most interesting concepts remains tantalizingly out of reach. Whether Malibron ever truly existed as a fifth chaos god, or is simply the product of fan speculation and wishful thinking, his story adds depth to our understanding of how the Warhammer 40,000 universe developed and evolved. In the end, Malibron's greatest contribution to Warhammer 40,000 lore may be his very absence. He reminds us that the universe we love is not fixed or inevitable, but the result of countless creative decisions, some of which were later reversed or abandoned. The fact that Games Workshop was willing to completely erase a developed concept suggests both the radical nature of early 40k development and the company's commitment to shaping their universe according to their vision, even when that meant sacrificing interesting ideas. Malibron stands as a testament to the paths not taken, the stories not told, and the gods not worshipped. In a universe where knowledge is power and ignorance is bliss, perhaps it's appropriate that the most interesting god is the one we're not allowed to know. Thank you for joining the Lorelord on this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40,000's most obscure mysteries. Did I miss any evidence of Malibron's existence? Do you have access to any early materials that might shed light on this lost piece of lore? Let me know in the comments. The search for the truth about the fifth chaos god continues. If you enjoyed this exploration of hidden lore and forgotten concepts, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries that lurk in the shadows of our favorite universes. Hit that notification bell to stay updated on all the latest discoveries. And remember, sometimes the most interesting truths are the ones that were deemed too dangerous to tell. This is the Lorelord, signing off from the dark corners of the 41st millennium. Keep seeking the hidden knowledge. And remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, even the gods can be forgotten.